"Get your hands off me!" Maya Brooks shouted as Airport Security Officer Jake Morrison grabbed her arm violently, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Ma'am, you need to step aside. This gate is for first-class passengers only." His voice dripped with disdain as he looked at her simple jeans and cotton shirt. "I have a first-class ticket." Maya pulled out her boarding pass, but Morrison barely glanced at it. "Yeah, right, and I'm the pilot," he sneered. "Look, lady, I don't know how you got that fake ticket, but you're not getting on this plane." Other passengers stared, some pulling out phones to record. A wealthy businessman in an expensive suit laughed. Security should check how she even afforded to be in this terminal. The humiliation burned through Maya like acid. Morrison's grip tightened as he tried to drag her away from the boarding gate. "You're coming with me, miss." Maya's military training kicked in. She could have broken his wrist in 2 seconds, but she stayed calm even as he twisted her arm behind her back. "Sir, you're hurting me," she said firmly. "Good," he spat. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to scam your way onto flights you can't afford." That's when Flight 447's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical emergency. Captain Mitchell has collapsed. We need any military pilots to identify themselves immediately." Maya looked directly into Morrison's shocked eyes. "Colonel Maya Brooks, United States Air Force. Now let go of me before 312 people die. If you believe that true courage reveals itself in the most unexpected moments, type courage below." Morrison's face went white as passengers began to realize what they had just witnessed. The woman he had been physically restraining and humiliating was exactly who the desperate flight crew needed. Maya gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm. "Officer Morrison," she said, reading his name tag, "you might want to call your supervisor. You just assaulted a decorated military officer in front of 200 witnesses." The gate agent, Jennifer Walsh, rushed over with her face flushed red with embarrassment. "Colonel Brooks, I am so sorry. Please, the flight crew needs you immediately." Maya nodded professionally, but the damage was done. Every passenger boarding Flight 447 had seen a black woman being physically manhandled by security, simply for existing in first class. As Maya walked toward the aircraft, she could hear Morrison frantically speaking into his radio. Control, I need backup at Gate 23. We have a situation." But the situation was about to become much bigger than Jake Morrison could ever imagine. Within the next hour, Colonel Maya Brooks would not only save 312 lives, but expose a pattern of racial profiling at Seattle International Airport that would make national headlines and end careers. The businessman who had laughed at her expense, Vincent Crawford, watched Maya board the plane with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. Did that security guard really just assault a military colonel? His wife Patricia whispered. Vincent shrugged uncomfortably. He had laughed along with the assumption that Maya didn't belong in first class. Now he was about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. Flight 447 was a Boeing 777 bound for Boston, carrying some of the most powerful people in American business and politics. But none of them would matter over the next hour. The only person who mattered was the woman they had all just watched being humiliated and physically attacked for the crime of being black in first class. As Maya settled into seat 2A, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had faced discrimination throughout her military career, but it never stopped stinging. The irony wasn't lost on her. In 30 minutes, these same people who had watched her be assaulted would be depending on her to save their lives. Captain Charles Mitchell had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. He had survived 3 emergency landings, 2 engine failures, and countless storms. But at 35,000 feet over the Pacific Northwest, his body simply shut down. The massive heart attack hit him like a freight train, sending him into cardiac arrest as his hands fell away from the controls. Co-pilot Daniel Martinez, only 28 years old with 6 years of commercial experience, watched in horror as his captain began convulsing violently. "Mayday! Mayday!" Daniel's voice cracked over the intercom as he struggled to maintain control of the Boeing 777. "This is Flight 447. Captain Mitchell is unconscious. We have a medical emergency and need immediate assistance." The storm system they were flying into was unlike anything in recorded meteorological history. Category 5, Hurricane-force winds, lightning strikes that lit up the entire sky, and turbulence so severe that the aircraft felt like a toy in the hands of an angry child. Daniel had never flown solo in conditions like this. Hell, he had never flown solo in anything more severe than light rain. In the passenger cabin, panic was beginning to set in. Children cried as their parents held them tight. Business executives who controlled billion-dollar empires sat powerless as their aircraft shook violently through the storm. The elderly gripped their armrests with white knuckles, some praying aloud, others typing what they feared might be final messages to their families. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel's voice came over the intercom again, barely controlled terror bleeding through his professional training. "We are experiencing severe weather conditions and a medical emergency in the cockpit. I need immediate assistance from anyone with military aviation experience. Please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." Maya opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. She saw fear, panic, and desperation on every face. But she also saw something else. The same passengers who had just watched her be physically assaulted by security were now looking around desperately for someone to save them. The irony was profound and painful. Vincent Crawford stood up from his first-class seat, puffing out his chest with the same arrogance he displayed in boardroom meetings. "Listen here," he called toward the cockpit, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I've flown with private pilots for 20 years. I have extensive experience in luxury aircraft. I can help this kid figure it out." A flight attendant, Robert Thompson, approached Vincent's seat. Thompson had been flying for 25 years and had seen every type of passenger emergency imaginable. "Sir, we need someone with specific military flight training. Civilian experience, even extensive civilian experience, isn't sufficient for these conditions. Are you questioning my qualifications?" Vincent's voice rose, his privilege and entitlement on full display even as the aircraft shook violently around them. "I didn't pay $18,000 for these first-class seats to have some kid crash us into the ocean because he's too inexperienced to handle a little weather." That's when Maya Brooks stood up. Her movement was fluid, precise, unlike the desperate agitation of the other passengers. As she walked down the aisle toward the cockpit, Vincent Crawford and several other passengers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Excuse me," Maya said to Robert Thompson, her voice calm and professional despite the chaos around them. "Colonel Maya Brooks, United States Air Force. 2,000 flight hours in F-22 Raptors, expert in emergency navigation and combat aviation. I can help." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the roar of the storm outside. Vincent Crawford stared at her with his mouth open. The same woman he had watched being physically assaulted at the gate was now claiming to be one of the most elite pilots in the American military. "You've got to be kidding me," Vincent muttered, loud enough for everyone in first class to hear. "Look, I respect our military, but I'm not going to bet my life on some kind of affirmative action fantasy. My wife and I paid a fortune for these seats precisely to avoid situations like this." Patricia Crawford, Vincent's wife, grabbed his arm. "Vincent, stop. You're being ridiculous." But Vincent was too deep into his prejudice to listen to reason, even from his own wife. "Ridiculous?" Vincent turned to face her, indignant. "I'm trying to save our lives. I'm not going to trust our safety to someone who was just being escorted away from the gate by security. Did you see how she was dressed? Does she look like she belongs in the cockpit of a commercial aircraft?" The cruelty of his words cut through the cabin like a knife. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly woman in first class whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She does look awfully young to be a colonel. Are we sure she's really qualified?" The subtext was clear and painful. Maya Brooks was being questioned not because of her credentials, but because she was a black woman who didn't fit their narrow definition of what a military pilot should look like. Daniel Martinez appeared at the cabin door, his face pale with terror and exhaustion. "Please," he called out desperately, "anyone with military flight experience needs to come forward immediately. Captain Mitchell is in cardiac arrest, and I've never flown solo in conditions this severe. We need help now." Vincent stood up again, straightening his expensive suit jacket. "Son, I've got 20 years of experience in private aircraft. I've flown across Europe, South America, all over the world. I know emergency procedures, I know aviation, and I know how to handle pressure. Let me help you." Maya watched this exchange with a mixture of sadness and familiar frustration. She had faced this same dynamic throughout her military career, having to prove herself twice as hard as any man, 3 times as hard as any white colleague, even in life-or-death situations where competence should be the only factor that mattered. Robert Thompson looked between Vincent and Maya, clearly torn. Vincent was a paying first-class passenger who projected confidence and authority. Maya was the woman who had just been physically manhandled by airport security. From a liability standpoint, the choice seemed obvious to someone who didn't understand military aviation. "Sir," Thompson said to Vincent, "if you're willing to assist, please come forward. We need all the help we can get." But Maya Brooks had not become one of the most decorated pilots in Air Force history by backing down when lives were at stake. As Vincent walked toward the cockpit with a smug expression, Maya followed calmly behind. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "before you put passengers' lives in the hands of a civilian, you might want to verify actual qualifications rather than assumptions based on ticket price." In the cockpit, Daniel Martinez was fighting a losing battle against forces beyond his training. The Boeing 777 was being tossed through the storm like a paper airplane, while Captain Mitchell lay unconscious, his vital signs failing on the medical monitors. Vincent Crawford entered the cockpit and immediately began barking orders. "Son, first thing you need to do is get us above this storm. Take us to 42,000 feet. Full power." Daniel looked at him uncertainly. "Sir, with respect, our service ceiling is 43,100 feet, and at our current weight, climbing in these conditions could cause structural—" "Kid, I've been flying longer than you've been alive," Vincent interrupted. "I've seen every type of weather condition imaginable. Trust me, you need altitude to get above this turbulence." Maya appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Mr. Martinez," she said calmly, "climbing into severe turbulence at maximum altitude with a heavily loaded aircraft is one of the fastest ways to cause wing separation. What you need is a controlled descent to find stable air below the storm cell." Vincent whirled around to face her. "Lady, this is not the time for whatever point you're trying to prove. Lives are at stake here. Real lives of real people who paid good money for safe transportation." The racism in his statement was barely veiled, but Maya had heard worse throughout her career. "Mr. Crawford," she said, reading his name from the passenger manifest she had glimpsed. "I understand you're concerned about your investment in this flight, but emergency aviation procedures aren't determined by ticket prices." "Listen here," Vincent's voice rose to a shout. "I don't know what kind of stolen valor situation this is, but I'm not going to let you play dress-up pilot with our lives. Daniel, ignore her. Take us up to 42,000 feet immediately." That's when Maya did something that changed the entire dynamic in the cockpit. Without raising her voice or showing any aggression, she began to recite emergency procedures with the precision of someone who had lived them. "Emergency descent checklist for severe turbulence," she said calmly. "Autopilot disconnect, thrust levers idle, speed brakes extend. Descent rate 4,000 feet per minute maximum to prevent structural overstress. Maintain target speed, 250 knots indicated below 10,000 feet. She continued for another minute, detailing procedures that only highly trained military pilots would know by heart. Daniel Martinez stared at her with growing relief and admiration. "Mom, those are exact Boeing 777 emergency procedures. How do you know our systems so well?" "Because I've flown aircraft far more complex than this in far worse conditions," Maya replied. "And because I spent 6 months as a military liaison to Boeing, helping them develop emergency protocols for situations exactly like this one." Vincent's face was turning red with frustration and embarrassment. "Anyone can memorize procedures from a manual. That doesn't make you qualified to fly a commercial aircraft with 312 souls on board." But Maya was no longer paying attention to Vincent Crawford. She was focused on Daniel Martinez, who was looking at her with the desperate hope of someone who had found exactly what he needed. "Colonel Brooks," Daniel said formally, "I'm officially requesting your assistance under Emergency Aviation Authority. Will you help me save this aircraft?" Maya nodded and moved toward the co-pilot controls. "Mr. Crawford, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat. This cockpit is about to become a very busy place. Like hell I am, Vincent shot back. I'm not leaving our lives in the hands of someone who doesn't belong here. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Maya had heard variations of doesn't belong here throughout her entire military career. In flight school, in combat zones, in promotion boards, in briefing rooms filled with white male officers who looked at her and saw everything except competence. But she had also learned something those officers hadn't: how to turn doubt into fuel, skepticism into motivation, and prejudice into an unshakable determination to prove excellence under pressure. "Mr. Crawford," Maya said quietly, "you're right about one thing. I don't belong here. I belong in an F-22 Raptor, flying combat missions over hostile territory. But today, 312 people need me here. So here is exactly where I'm going to be." What none of them knew was that Maya carried more than just exceptional flying skills into that cockpit. 2 years earlier, she had lost her closest squadron mate, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, in a training accident caused by a senior officer who refused to listen to Sarah's concerns about weather conditions. Maya had held Sarah as she died, promising her that she would never let rank or prejudice silence the voice of competence again. That promise had cost Maya 2 promotions when she challenged superior officers. But tonight, 35,000 feet above the Pacific, that same defiance would save 312 lives. Maya moved to the co-pilot seat and began rapidly assessing their situation. The storm was worse than Daniel had described, winds gusting over 150 mph, lightning strikes hitting the aircraft every 30 seconds, and turbulence so severe that it was affecting the aircraft's structural integrity. "Daniel," she said calmly, "I need current altitude, speed, and fuel status." Her voice carried an authority that came from years of making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "We're at 37,000 feet, speed 480 knots, fuel showing 18,000 pounds remaining," Daniel replied, his voice steadying for the first time since the emergency began. Vincent Crawford was still standing behind them, his privilege and arrogance intact, even as the aircraft shook violently around them. "This is insane," he muttered. "I'm not going to watch some DEI hire crash us into the ocean because you're too politically correct to admit she's not qualified." Maya had heard DEI hire before. It was the latest code phrase used by people who couldn't accept that a black woman might actually be more qualified than they were. She had heard it during her promotion to colonel, during her assignment to the Pentagon, during every achievement that challenged someone's preconceived notions about who belonged in positions of authority. "Mr. Crawford," Maya said without turning around, "I'm going to make you a promise. When we land safely in Boston, and we will land safely, you're going to have some very uncomfortable conversations about what just happened here." "Is that a threat?" Vincent demanded. "No, sir," Maya replied calmly. "It's just meteorology. This storm is being tracked by every air traffic control center on the West Coast. Our emergency is being monitored by NORAD, the Pentagon, and the Federal Aviation Administration. Every word spoken in this cockpit is being recorded. Your comments about my qualifications based on my race and gender are now part of the official record of this emergency." The color drained from Vincent's face as he realized the implications. Maya continued flying while delivering what amounted to a career death sentence. "Additionally," she continued, "your assault of a military officer at the airport gate was recorded by approximately 50 passengers on their cell phones. Those videos are probably being uploaded to social media right now. By the time we land, you'll be famous, Mr. Crawford, just not in the way you were expecting." Vincent Crawford had built his fortune on his ability to intimidate and dominate others. But Maya Brooks was proving to be something he had never encountered before. Someone who was not only unintimidated by his wealth and privilege, but someone who wielded a level of competence and authority that made his posturing look ridiculous. Daniel Martinez was watching this exchange with growing amazement. "Colonel, how do you stay so calm? I mean, the conditions outside are impossible. Captain Mitchell is dying, and this guy is being racist." Maya finished for him. "Daniel, I've been dealing with people like Mr. Crawford my entire career. The difference is today his prejudice might actually help save lives." "How?" Daniel asked, confused. Maya smiled for the first time since the emergency began. "Because while he was busy explaining why I'm not qualified, I've been calculating our exact route through this storm, and I just figured out how to get us home." Maya's hands moved over the controls with a precision that mesmerized Daniel Martinez. She wasn't just flying the aircraft. She was conducting a symphony of physics, meteorology, and engineering that turned their Boeing 777 into something resembling a fighter jet. "Daniel, I need you to contact Seattle Air Traffic Control and request direct communication with McCord Air Force Base," Maya instructed, while simultaneously adjusting their flight path through calculations that seemed impossible for the human brain to process. "McCord Air Force Base?" Daniel asked, confused. "Why do we need the military?" "Because," Maya said calmly, "what I'm about to do has never been attempted in a commercial aircraft. I need real-time weather radar from military satellites to thread this aircraft through the storm using a technique developed for combat operations." Vincent Crawford, who had been silent since learning his racist comments were being recorded, suddenly found his voice again. "You're experimenting with our lives. This is exactly why civilians shouldn't trust military pilots in commercial situations." Maya turned to look at him directly for the first time. "Mr. Crawford, you seem confused about something fundamental. I'm not a military pilot in a commercial situation. I'm a combat pilot in a survival situation. There's a significant difference." Daniel was already on the radio with Seattle ATC. "Seattle Control, Flight 447, requesting immediate contact with McCord Air Force Base for emergency weather assistance." The response came immediately. "Flight 447, this is Seattle Control. We're patching you through to McCord Base operations. Be advised, they've been monitoring your emergency and are standing by." A new voice came over the radio, crisp and professional. "Flight 447, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes, McCord Base operations. Please identify the military personnel assisting with your emergency." Maya took the radio. "Colonel Hayes, this is Colonel Maya Brooks, callsign Spectre. I'm requesting real-time satellite weather data for emergency navigation through the storm system." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then Colonel Hayes's voice returned, filled with something that sounded like relief and admiration. "Spectre, this is Raptor Base. We confirm your identity. Colonel Brooks, you are cleared for any and all support you require. We have the Secretary of Defense monitoring this situation personally. The entire Pacific Northwest Air Corridor has been cleared for your emergency approach." Vincent Crawford's mouth fell open. Daniel Martinez stared at Maya with something approaching awe. "Colonel," Daniel whispered, "who exactly are you?" Maya was adjusting their descent angle using calculations that defied conventional aviation wisdom. "I'm someone who spent 15 years learning how to fly through impossible situations and bring everyone home alive." Colonel Hayes's voice came back over the radio. "Spectre, we're uploading real-time weather data to your aircraft navigation system. We show the eye of the storm system approximately 40 nautical miles southwest of your position. Recommend immediate descent to 15,000 feet and course adjustment to heading 270. "Negative, Raptor Base," Maya replied. "I'm taking us down to 8,000 feet and through the southern wall of the system. It's going to be rough, but it's our only chance to avoid the worst of the wind shear." "Spectre, that trajectory goes against all conventional storm avoidance protocols." Maya's voice carried the confidence of someone who had rewritten protocols through experience. "Raptor Base, conventional protocols are for conventional situations. This storm system is generating wind patterns I've only seen in combat zones. I'm going to fly us through it the same way I'd fly through enemy territory, low, fast, and with absolute precision." The admiration in Colonel Hayes's voice was unmistakable. "Understood, Spectre. You have our complete confidence and full support. McCord emergency response is being positioned for your arrival." Vincent Crawford had gone completely silent, finally beginning to understand that he was witnessing something far beyond his comprehension. Maya Brooks wasn't just a pilot. She was a legend in the military aviation community, someone whose skills were studied in war colleges and whose techniques were classified at the highest levels. "Daniel," Maya said, "I need you to trust me completely for the next 20 minutes. What I'm about to do is going to feel like we're crashing, but we're not. We're going to dance with this storm until it lets us through." Robert Thompson, the veteran flight attendant, had returned to the cockpit to check on Captain Mitchell's condition. What he witnessed in the next few minutes would change his understanding of what was possible in aviation. Maya Brooks was flying their Boeing 777 through maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible for an aircraft of that size. She was using updrafts and downdrafts, like a surfer uses waves, finding pockets of stable air in the middle of the storm that no conventional pilot would even know existed. "This is impossible," Robert whispered, watching the navigation displays show their aircraft threading through storm cells that should have torn them apart. "No," Maya replied calmly. "This is physics. Every storm has a rhythm, a pattern of energy flow. If you understand that pattern, you can find the spaces between the violence." Daniel Martinez was learning more about flying in 30 minutes than he had learned in 6 years of commercial aviation. "Colonel, how are you calculating these turns without computer assistance?" 10,000 hours of combat flight time, Maya answered while executing a descent that felt like controlled falling. When you're flying through surface-to-air missile fire with a damaged aircraft, you learn to see air currents the way a musician sees notes on a page. Vincent Crawford, who had been silent for the past 20 minutes, was gripping the back of the pilot's seat with white knuckles. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something resembling terror and reluctant respect. "Colonel," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Maya didn't take her attention away from flying, but her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the cockpit stop breathing. "Mr. Crawford, your apology can wait. Right now you're watching 15 years of training that you thought was impossible because it came from someone who doesn't look like your idea of competence." The aircraft suddenly dropped 500 feet in an air pocket, causing several passengers to scream. Maya corrected instantly, her hands moving over the controls with movements so precise they looked choreographed. "What you're seeing," she continued, "is what happens when the military trains someone without caring about their race or gender, only about their ability to perform miracles under pressure." Colonel Hayes's voice came over the radio. "Spectre, we're tracking your progress. Your navigation through that storm system is being recorded for future training purposes. What you're doing is unprecedented." "Raptor Base," Maya replied. "Patch me through to the passengers on the cabin address system. They deserve to know what's happening." A moment later, Maya's voice echoed through the passenger cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Maya Brooks. I've taken command of this aircraft. We are navigating through severe weather conditions using advanced military techniques. I need everyone to remain calm and trust in training that was designed to bring people home from impossible situations." The effect on the passengers was immediate and profound. The panic that had been building for the past hour began to subside, replaced by something resembling hope. "In approximately 15 minutes, Maya continued, "we will be beginning our approach to Seattle International Airport, where emergency medical personnel are standing by to assist Captain Mitchell. I promise you this, the same skills that brought me home from combat missions in hostile territory will bring all of us home safely tonight." As her voice clicked off, something shifted in the passenger cabin. People began to realize they were witnessing something historic. Not just an emergency landing, but a display of competence so exceptional that it redefined their understanding of what was possible. Patricia Crawford turned to her husband. "Vincent, that woman you called unqualified just became our guardian angel." Vincent nodded slowly, the full weight of his prejudice and ignorance settling on him like a physical burden. "I know," he whispered, "and I'm going to have to live with what I said for the rest of my life. Doctor." Sarah Johnson, the cardiologist who had been quietly monitoring Captain Mitchell's condition, approached the cockpit as Maya continued her impossible navigation through the storm. "Colonel Brooks, Doctor," Johnson said, "I've been a passenger on over 200 flights in my medical career. What you're doing right now is the most skilled flying I've ever witnessed." Maya nodded acknowledgement while maintaining her focus on the controls. "Doctor, how is Captain Mitchell's condition?" "Stable but critical. He needs immediate cardiac intervention when we land. How much longer until we reach Seattle?" 12 minutes, Maya replied with the precision of someone who had calculated every second of their descent. "Doctor, Johnson, I need you to know that this landing is going to be unlike anything you've experienced on a commercial flight. I'm going to bring us down fast and steep to get through the storm's base layer." Doctor. Johnson had been on military medical flights before. Colonel, are you talking about a combat approach? Exactly. We're going to drop like a rock for the first 8,000 feet, then level out for a normal approach. It's going to feel like we're crashing, but it's actually the safest way to get through this weather. Robert Thompson, who had been skeptical of Maya from the beginning, was now watching her with something approaching awe. Colonel, I need to say something. When I first saw you at the gate being handled by security, I made assumptions. I was wrong. Completely wrong. Maya glanced at him briefly. Mr. Thompson, you weren't wrong because of who you are. You were wrong because of what this society teaches people to see when they look at someone like me. What do you mean? Robert asked. You saw a black woman in casual clothes being manhandled by security, and your training told you to see someone who didn't belong in first class. Your eyes didn't lie to you. Your conditioning did. Daniel Martinez was listening to this exchange while monitoring their rapid descent. Colonel, is that something you've dealt with your whole career? Maya's voice carried 15 years of experience with institutional racism. Daniel, I once had a general tell me I was surprisingly articulate after I briefed him on a complex tactical situation. I've been asked if I'm really qualified for positions that white men with half my experience never get questioned about. I've had to prove my competence 3 times as hard to get half the recognition. But you kept going, Dr. Johnson observed. I kept going because people like Sarah Chen didn't have the option to quit, Maya replied, referencing her lost squadron mate. Every time someone underestimated me, I used it as fuel to become better. Every time someone doubted my qualifications, I proved them wrong by saving lives they couldn't save. Vincent Crawford, who had been listening to every word, finally spoke up. Colonel, I understand now why my comments were so damaging. I wasn't just questioning your abilities. I was perpetuating a system that forces people like you to prove yourselves over and over again. Maya executed a turn that brought them into alignment with Seattle's runway approach. Mr. Crawford, understanding the problem is the first step, but understanding doesn't undo the damage. Right now, there are thousands of qualified women and minorities in the military who are fighting the same battles I fought, proving themselves to people who will never see their competence because of prejudices they refuse to examine. Colonel Hayes's voice came over the radio. Spectre, Seattle Tower has cleared you for emergency approach. All other aircraft have been diverted. You have absolute priority. Raptor Base, Maya replied. Thank you for the support. This aircraft is about to demonstrate what happens when military training meets civilian aviation in a crisis. Spectre, Colonel Hayes said. For the record, your techniques today are going to be studied at the Air War College. You've just rewritten emergency aviation protocols. Maya smiled as she began their final approach. Raptor Base, tell the War College that the best innovation happens when you stop limiting your talent pool based on appearances and start promoting based on performance. The landing gear extended with a mechanical whir that sounded like salvation to the 312 passengers who had been preparing for the worst. Maya Brooks was about to attempt something that aviation experts would later describe as impossible. Landing a Boeing 777 in crosswinds exceeding 120 millistharms using techniques developed for military aircraft in combat zones. Daniel, Maya said calmly, I need you to monitor our approach speed very carefully. We're going to come in at 180 knots instead of the normal 140, then use reverse thrust and spoilers in a sequence that's going to feel like controlled violence. Colonel, Daniel asked nervously, is this safe? Maya's response carried the weight of someone who had landed damaged aircraft on hostile runways while under enemy fire. Safe is relative. Staying in this storm for another 20 minutes is certain death. This landing is controlled risk. Seattle Tower's voice crackled over the radio. Flight 447, winds are gusting 125 mph with severe crosswinds. Are you certain you want to attempt this approach? Tower, this is Colonel Brooks. I've landed aircraft in worse conditions in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're coming in. The passengers could feel the aircraft descending rapidly, faster than any commercial landing they had ever experienced. Through the windows, lightning continued to illuminate the darkness like a supernatural light show. Vincent Crawford was gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Jesus Christ, he whispered. She's really going to try to land in this. Patricia Crawford looked at her husband with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Vincent, if anyone can do this, it's her. Look how calm she is." Indeed, Maya's voice over the intercom was steadier than most people's voices in normal conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach to Seattle International Airport. This landing will be more aggressive than a normal commercial approach. You may feel rapid deceleration and unusual aircraft movements. This is intentional and controlled." Dr. Johnson was monitoring Captain Mitchell while simultaneously marveling at Maya's composure. "Colonel, your heart rate right now is probably lower than mine and you're flying through a hurricane." "Doctor," Maya replied, "panic burns oxygen your brain needs for calculations. Staying calm isn't just emotional management, it's a tactical necessity." The aircraft was now descending through 5,000 feet, and the turbulence was unlike anything the passengers had ever experienced. The Boeing 777 was being thrown around like a toy, but Maya's control inputs were keeping them aligned with the runway through mathematical precision that bordered on supernatural. "How is she doing this?" Robert Thompson whispered to Daniel. "She's not fighting the wind," Daniel explained, finally understanding Maya's technique. "She's using it. Every gust that should be pushing us off course, she's redirecting into forward momentum." Colonel Hayes's voice came over the radio. "Spectre, we have emergency vehicles positioned every 500 feet along the runway. Medical personnel standing by for Captain Mitchell. You have every resource we can provide." "Raptor base," Maya replied, while executing a correction that kept them centered on the approach despite a crosswind that should have been impossible to overcome. "Tell the emergency crews this is going to be a military-style landing. Short rollout, aggressive braking, have them positioned for rapid aircraft evacuation." At 1,000 feet, the storm was throwing everything it had at them. Lightning struck the aircraft's exterior 3 times in 30 seconds, but Maya's focus never wavered. "Daniel," she said, "when we touch down, I need you to deploy full spoilers immediately, then maximum reverse thrust. Don't wait for my command. Do it the instant you feel the main gear touch." "Understood, Colonel." Vincent Crawford was watching Maya's profile as she guided their aircraft through the final 500 feet of what should have been an impossible approach. Her face showed absolute concentration, but no fear, no doubt, no hesitation. This was someone who had made peace with danger long ago and learned to dance with it instead of fighting it. 100 feet, Maya called out, her voice steady as granite. "Daniel, prepare for touchdown in 15 seconds. This is going to be aggressive." The Boeing 777 hit the runway with a force that rattled every bolt in the aircraft. But instead of the violent crash that the passengers expected, it was controlled violence. The kind of precision force that comes from someone who understands exactly how much stress an aircraft can handle and exactly how to use that stress productively. "Reverse thrust now," Maya commanded, and Daniel complied instantly. The sound of the engines reversing was like controlled explosions, decelerating their massive aircraft from 180 mph to controllable speed in less than 3,000 feet of runway. "Spoilers full," Maya called out, and the aircraft's wing spoilers deployed like mechanical flowers, creating drag that helped slow their momentum while keeping them firmly planted on the rain-soaked runway. Through the cockpit windows, they could see emergency vehicles racing alongside them, their red and blue lights creating a corridor of safety through the storm. Fire trucks, ambulances, and military vehicles formed an escort that made their landing look like the arrival of a head of state. "We're down!" Daniel shouted with relief and amazement. "Colonel, we're actually down!" Maya was already running through post-landing checklists with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Engines to idle, flaps to zero, spoilers retracted, parking brake set. Her hands moved over the controls with the same precision she had maintained throughout the entire emergency. Colonel Hayes's voice came over the radio, filled with something that sounded like professional admiration mixed with disbelief. "Spectre, that was the most remarkable emergency landing in the history of commercial aviation. You just set records that will stand for decades." "Raptor base," Maya replied while monitoring Captain Mitchell's vital signs. "Records don't matter. Everyone on board is alive, and that's what matters." The passengers were beginning to realize what they had just experienced. Applause started somewhere in the back of the aircraft, and swept forward through the cabin like a wave. People were crying, laughing, praying, and cheering simultaneously. Dr. Johnson was already preparing Captain Mitchell for medical evacuation. "Colonel, his vital signs are stable. You bought him the time he needed. The cardiac team at Harborview Medical Center is standing by." Maya stood up from the pilot's seat for the first time in over an hour. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis was beginning to fade, and she felt the full weight of what they had just accomplished. Vincent Crawford approached her slowly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Colonel Brooks," he said quietly, "I need to say something, and I need everyone in this cockpit to hear it." Maya turned to face him, and Vincent saw something in her eyes that he had never noticed before. Not anger or resentment, but a deep sadness that came from a lifetime of having to prove her worth to people who should have recognized it immediately. "Colonel," Vincent began, his voice breaking slightly, "I'm a successful businessman. I've built companies, managed billions of dollars, made decisions that affected thousands of people. But tonight I learned that success and wisdom are not the same thing." He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of his mistake. "When I saw you at the gate being handled by security, I made assumptions based on your race and gender. When you identified yourself as a military pilot, I dismissed your qualifications because they didn't match my preconceived notions of competence." Maya listened without interrupting, giving Vincent the space to fully confront his prejudice. "What I witnessed tonight," Vincent continued, "was not just exceptional piloting. It was a masterclass in leadership, courage, and grace under pressure. You saved my life, my wife's life, and the lives of 310 other people, and you did it while maintaining dignity in the face of racism that I perpetuated." Daniel Martinez, Robert Thompson, and Dr. Johnson were all listening to this confession with varying degrees of discomfort and recognition. "Mr. Crawford," Maya said finally, "I appreciate your honesty. But your apology, while necessary, doesn't undo the system that created your assumptions. Right now, there are qualified women and minorities in every field who are fighting the same battles I fought tonight, having to prove themselves exceptional just to be considered equal." Vincent nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "What can I do? How do I make this right?" Maya considered the question seriously. "You can use your success and influence to create opportunities for people who look like me. You can question your assumptions before you voice them. And you can remember this moment every time you're tempted to judge someone's competence based on their appearance." The aircraft door opened, and paramedics rushed in to attend to Captain Mitchell. Maya watched them work with the efficiency she had just demonstrated in the cockpit, professionals doing what they were trained to do, regardless of who was watching or judging. "Colonel Brooks," one of the paramedics said, "we need to get Captain Mitchell to the hospital immediately. The cardiac team is standing by." Maya nodded. "Go. He's stable, but he needs immediate intervention." As the medical team wheeled Captain Mitchell off the aircraft, Maya realized that her emergency was far from over. She was about to face something that might be more challenging than flying through the storm, dealing with the media attention, the investigation, and the consequences of Vincent Crawford's recorded comments. But she had faced worse challenges before, and she had always emerged stronger. Tonight would be no different. As passengers began deplaning, Maya Brooks remained in the cockpit, completing the extensive paperwork required after an emergency landing. But her mind was already moving beyond the immediate crisis to the larger implications of what had just occurred. Airport Security Chief Michael Rodriguez was the first official to board the aircraft, and his face was grim with the knowledge of what his officer had done. Behind him walked FBI agent Janet Morrison, whose presence indicated that Jake Morrison's assault of a military officer was now a federal matter. "Colonel Brooks," Chief Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with embarrassment and anger, "I need to apologize on behalf of Seattle International Airport for the unconscionable behavior of Officer Morrison. What happened at the gate was not just unprofessional, it was criminal." Maya looked up from her paperwork. "Chief Rodriguez, your officer's actions were symptomatic of a larger problem. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was the predictable result of systemic bias in your security protocols." Agent Morrison stepped forward. "Colonel, I need to inform you that Officer Morrison has been arrested and charged with assault of a federal officer, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority." The videos from passengers' phones show clear evidence of racial profiling and excessive force. What videos? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew. Approximately 40 passengers recorded the incident at the gate, Agent Morrison explained. The footage shows Officer Morrison physically restraining you, making racially charged assumptions about your ticket validity, and using excessive force without probable cause. These videos have already been shared on social media over 50,000 times. Maya sighed. She had hoped to handle this quietly, but in the age of social media, there was no such thing as a quiet injustice anymore. Daniel Martinez, who had been listening to this conversation, spoke up. Agent Morrison, you should also know that Mr. Crawford's comments during the emergency were recorded by our cockpit voice recorder. Those recordings contain clear evidence of racial bias and discrimination. Vincent Crawford, who was still on the aircraft trying to process his own behavior, overheard this statement. The color drained from his face as he realized the full scope of his exposure. Agent Morrison, Vincent said quietly, I need to make a statement about my behavior during this emergency. Maya watched as Vincent Crawford, a man who had spent his entire life believing his privilege would protect him from consequences, began to understand that some actions have implications beyond personal embarrassment. Mr. Crawford, Agent Morrison said, you're not under investigation at this time. However, given that your comments were made during a federal aviation emergency and recorded on official aircraft systems, they may be relevant to our civil rights investigation of the airport security incident. Chief Rodriguez was taking notes furiously. Colonel Brooks, as part of our internal investigation, we've discovered that Officer Morrison has a pattern of complaints filed against him for racial profiling. 7 complaints in the past 2 years, all involving passengers of color being questioned or detained without probable cause. Why wasn't this pattern addressed earlier? Maya asked, though she knew the answer. Because, Chief Rodriguez admitted, the complaints were filed individually, and we treated them as isolated incidents rather than recognizing the systemic pattern. We failed to protect the traveling public from discriminatory treatment by our own security personnel. Dr. Johnson, who had returned to the aircraft after ensuring Captain Mitchell's transfer to the hospital, joined the conversation. Colonel, I've been flying commercially for 15 years, and I've witnessed this kind of behavior before, but I've never seen anyone handle it with the grace and professionalism you showed tonight. Maya stood up and began gathering her flight materials. Dr. Johnson, grace under pressure isn't a luxury, it's a survival skill. When you're constantly having your qualifications questioned, you learn to let your competence speak louder than other people's prejudices. Agent Morrison was coordinating with federal prosecutors via phone. Colonel, the U.S. Attorney's Office wants to speak with you about pressing federal charges against Officer Morrison. They're also interested in using this case to investigate broader patterns of discrimination in airport security nationwide. Maya considered this carefully. Agent Morrison, I'll cooperate fully with the investigation, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't about revenge against one officer. This is about creating systemic change, so that no other qualified person has to prove their worth while being physically assaulted. Vincent Crawford approached Maya hesitantly. Colonel, I know my apology isn't sufficient, but I want you to know that I'm going to use this experience to examine every aspect of my business practices. My companies have diversity and inclusion policies, but clearly those policies haven't changed my personal biases. Maya nodded. Mr. Crawford, policy changes are necessary, but not sufficient. What matters is whether you're willing to use your privilege to amplify voices that have been systematically silenced. How do I do that? Vincent asked. Start by asking yourself why it took a life-threatening emergency for you to recognize competence that was obvious from the moment I identified myself, Maya replied. Then ask yourself how many other qualified people you've dismissed because they didn't look like your idea of expertise. Robert Thompson, the flight attendant who had initially doubted Maya's qualifications, spoke up. Colonel, I want to make a statement for the record. When I first saw you at the gate, I made the same assumptions Mr. Crawford made. Your response to our crisis tonight has shown me that my training in recognizing passenger competence has been influenced by unconscious bias. Maya looked around the cockpit at the faces surrounding her. law enforcement officials, airline personnel, passengers, and one very chastened businessman. Everyone in this cockpit tonight learned something about the difference between assumptions and reality. The question is whether that learning leads to lasting change or just temporary embarrassment. Chief Rodriguez closed his notebook. Colonel, I can promise you that Seattle International Airport is going to implement comprehensive bias training for all security personnel. We're also reviewing our complaint reporting system to identify patterns before they result in situations like tonight. Maya picked up her flight bag and prepared to leave the aircraft. Chief Rodriguez, training is important, but accountability is essential. Officer Morrison's behavior tonight wasn't the result of insufficient training, it was the result of insufficient consequences for previous misconduct. As Maya walked toward the aircraft door, she reflected on the events of the past 2 hours. She had saved 312 lives, exposed systemic racism, and proved once again that competence transcends the narrow definitions that prejudice tries to impose. But she also knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new assumptions to overcome, and new opportunities to prove that excellence doesn't ask permission to exist. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing, Colonel Maya Brooks stood at the podium of the Senate Armed Services Committee, testifying about discrimination in military and civilian aviation. The hearing room was packed with media, military officials, and civil rights advocates who had followed her story since that stormy night in Seattle. "Senators," Maya began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided a damaged aircraft through impossible conditions. What happened on Flight 447 was not an isolated incident of individual prejudice. It was a systemic failure that occurs when institutions allow bias to override competence in life-threatening situations. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, leaned forward. "Colonel Brooks, can you explain how the discrimination you faced could have affected the safety of Flight 447's passengers?" Maya had prepared for this question, but the answer still carried the weight of 312 lives that had hung in the balance. "Senator, if airport security's assumptions had prevented me from boarding that aircraft, or if the cockpit crew had listened to Mr. Crawford's objections to my assistance, everyone on Flight 447 would have died. Discrimination doesn't just harm its immediate targets. It can have catastrophic consequences for entire communities." The committee room was silent as Maya continued. "In my 15-year military career, I've encountered countless situations where qualified personnel were overlooked or dismissed because they didn't match traditional expectations of competence. This isn't just unfair, it's strategically dangerous for our national security." Senator James Mitchell spoke up. "Colonel, what changes do you recommend to prevent similar incidents?" Maya had spent months developing her recommendations, working with civil rights organizations, military leadership, and aviation authorities. First, mandatory bias training for all personnel in safety-critical positions. Second, accountability systems that track patterns of discriminatory behavior before they escalate to physical assault. Third, promotion and evaluation systems that prioritize demonstrated competence over cultural fit. In the gallery, Vincent Crawford sat listening to every word. His life had changed dramatically since Flight 447. The videos of his racist comments had indeed gone viral, resulting in the loss of several major business contracts and forcing him to sell his investment firm. But something else had changed too. His understanding of how his privilege had blinded him to the competence of others. After the hearing, Vincent approached Maya in the corridor outside the committee room. "Colonel, I wanted you to know that I've been working with the Equal Justice Initiative to fund aviation scholarships for underrepresented minorities." Maya studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance that had nearly cost them all their lives. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine humility and purpose. "Mr. Crawford," Maya said, "that's meaningful work. But scholarship funding addresses symptoms, not causes. The real question is whether you're using your business connections to create opportunities for advancement and leadership." Vincent nodded. "I've been having conversations with CEOs in my network about examining their own hiring and promotion practices. It's uncomfortable work, but necessary work." Maya appreciated his honesty. "Discomfort is the price of growth, Mr. Crawford. The question is whether you're willing to stay uncomfortable long enough to create lasting change. Dr. Johnson approached them, carrying a medical journal. "Colonel, I wanted to show you this," she said, handing Maya the publication. "The article about your emergency medical assessment of Captain Mitchell during the crisis. It's being used in medical schools to teach crisis decision-making under pressure." Maya flipped through the article, which detailed how her military medical training had stabilized Captain Mitchell during his cardiac arrest while simultaneously flying through the storm. "Dr. Johnson, this feels surreal. 6 months ago, people were questioning whether I belonged in first class. Now medical schools are studying my techniques. That's the power of proving competence through action," Dr. Johnson replied. "Your performance that night didn't just save lives, it created new standards for what's possible, when we stop limiting ourselves based on assumptions." Robert Thompson, the flight attendant who had initially doubted Maya's qualifications, had also come to Washington for the hearing. "Colonel, I wanted to tell you that our airline has completely revised its emergency protocols based on your techniques. We're also implementing bias recognition training for all crew members." Maya smiled at the irony. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate that. But the most important training isn't about recognizing bias in others. It's about recognizing bias in ourselves." As the group dispersed, Maya reflected on the unexpected consequences of that stormy night. Captain Mitchell had made a full recovery and returned to flying. Daniel Martinez had been promoted to captain and credited Maya as his inspiration. Jake Morrison, the security officer, had been convicted of civil rights violations and sentenced to prison. But the most significant change was harder to measure. The conversations happening in boardrooms, cockpits, and security offices across the country about the difference between assumptions and reality. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from her commanding officer. "Spectre, your next assignment is leading the Air Force's new Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. Interested?" Maya looked out at the Capitol dome, thinking about Sarah Chen and all the other qualified people whose voices had been silenced by prejudice. The military was finally ready to systematically address the biases that had plagued it for decades. She typed back, "Affirmative. Let's change some minds." As Maya Brooks walked down the Capitol steps, she carried with her the knowledge that excellence doesn't require permission to exist. It simply requires the courage to persist until the world catches up. Thank you to everyone who typed courage during this incredible journey. Maya's story reminds us that the most ordinary-looking person next to us might be extraordinary, and that our assumptions about competence can be not just wrong, but dangerously limiting. If stories like this inspire you to question your own assumptions and celebrate unexpected heroes, join our community of people who believe in justice, courage, and the power of transformation. We share incredible tales that prove character always triumphs over prejudice. Until next time, remember, greatness doesn't announce itself, but when lives are on the line, it always shows up.